Hello, 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 and welcome once again to CorpusCast, the podcast from Aston University about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. I'm your host, Dr. Robbie Love. On this episode, our topic is English language teaching, ELT, and my guest is someone with more experience than just about anyone in this area, with a career approaching 60 years, and over 30 of which spent in the application of corpus linguistics and the study and teaching of English. My guest has published 58 books, including a range of ELT course books and 120 academic papers dealing with research and teaching of the English language, especially as a second or a foreign language. My guest is Michael McCarthy, Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Nottingham. And I'm very, very grateful to Mike for joining us today on CorpusCast. So without any further ado, please welcome to CorpusCast, Mike McCarthy. Hello, Mike. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for speaking with me today.
Hello, Robbie. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's great to have the chance to chat with you. And there is so much more than we have time for that I would love to ask you. So we will be quite selective in zooming in on just a few topics that I want to discuss with you today. But as always, we'll begin with a question that I ask all of our guests on CorpusCast, which is, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Oh, well, I would think from one perspective, it's an obvious thing. It's a set of tools which take a lot of the drudgery out of linguistic analysis. We can achieve in seconds what years ago took us days to do in the pre-computer era, counting linguistic features in text, that sort of thing. From another perspective, it offers us this degree of objectivity, which can challenge our prejudgments and challenge what we feel is our intuitive grasp of language usage, how language actually is used. So I think those, to me, are the two main significant roles that corpus linguistics has played for me and continues to do so.
Now, I want to sort of go back a little bit before we dive more into what you have done with corpus linguistics specifically. As I said at the beginning, you've devoted your entire career to the study and teaching of English. So I suppose the obvious question to begin with is when and why and how did you first become interested in language, generally speaking, before we talk about corpus linguistics specifically?
Oh, well, this, I would say, goes back to my secondary school days. I discovered that I could do quite well at languages, which in my case were Welsh, French, and Spanish, with far less effort than I needed to devote to maths or geography. So I suppose it's an indication that I was a bit lazy in following the things that I was naturally good at. And I took a gap year at a time when the phrase gap year had not yet been invented, and I went off to Spain and got a job teaching English. I then came back and did a degree at Cambridge in Spanish and French, and later a PhD in comparative literature. I then had 2 great years as a fellow at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, after which I went back to university at Leeds to train as an ESL teacher. So this was the direction in which my career was taking me. I'd sort of moved out of literature and more into the language side. After that, I went to live in Sweden, where I taught English for just under 5 years. And then I guess came what I consider to be my big break. And I got a lectureship with John Sinclair's team at the University of Birmingham, just at the time when the co-build project was coming to fruition. And the whole corpus revolution was beginning to create significant waves in the world of applied linguistics. I stayed with John Sinclair for 8 years, after which I joined Ron Carter in the English department at Nottingham. where we hatched a plan to create the CAN Code spoken English corpus. And I had actually met Ron in Singapore in 1984, and we struck up a friendship and an academic partnership that persisted until his untimely death. I took early retirement from Nottingham in 2005, and since 2018, I've been teaching EAP part-time at the University of Cambridge. So it's been a long career and punctuated by different encounters with the language teaching profession, but I'm still at it, albeit part-time now, and I'm still enjoying it as much as ever.
So you said that you studied comparative literature and then found yourself sort of moving into language. I'm just curious, sort of going back, what was it that motivated that transition, so to speak?
Well, I had my PhD in comparative literature, and it was successful. But at the time, I had a very good reason to want to go and live in Sweden. And I realized that probably my future would be better served by teaching English language rather than English literature. But I must say, when I got to Sweden, the first couple of years, I did teach some literature and some literary stylistics. So the transition wasn't kind of overnight. But little by little, I developed more of an interest in the problems of teaching language rather than teaching literature. And I think the Swedish experience was one that confirmed that in me, that's where my real interest lay.
And when you found your way to Birmingham, working with John Sinclair and the co-build team, was that your first, I don't use the word exposure because that may have a negative semantic positive, but I'll use it anyway. Your first exposure to corpus linguistics, was that where that began for you, or had that started earlier than that?
No, absolutely. I mean, when I applied for the job at Birmingham, I don't think I had the slightest clue what corpus linguistics was. But I remember going to Birmingham for my interview with John and a panel that included Malcolm Coulthard and various other people. And I was aware of their work in discourse analysis, but it was only when I got the job and I began to chat with John and he began to, show me the ropes that I realized they were doing something quite unusual. My first memory of an encounter with John in his office was when he showed me in a filing cabinet punch cards, computer punch cards, which he had only relatively recently before that stopped using. So he had begun his research in a world where computers were, as it were, programmed through punching little holes in pieces of card. And I realized that they were on the cusp of something quite important because computers were beginning to become more powerful, more usable by non-specialist users. But I think the biggest thing of all was simply talking to John and hearing him talk about what he was doing and why he was doing it. They were creating a dictionary, a major dictionary, and the whole point was that it wasn't going to be produced in the way that dictionaries up until that point had been produced. It's a bit of a simplification, but basically in the pre-corpus era, if you wanted to write a dictionary, the first thing you did was just look at every other dictionary, make sure you had everything they had, and then maybe update it a bit and add the latest words and phrases. What John Sinclair did, was to go back to square one and said, look, we should not make any assumptions as to what the items in the language mean. We can use computer power to let us see through patterns of usage what the meanings and functions are of these linguistic items. This was an absolute revelation to me, and I think, to almost anybody who was working with John at that time. So that was my first encounter with corpus linguistics, was realizing its potential. I wasn't an expert at the actual computational side, no more than I am now. But the real eye-opener was what corpus linguistics could do rather than how one did corpus linguistics. That was my first real experience.
And you would go on to, extensively apply corpus methods in your own research and teaching. And one of your major contributions over a sustained period of time, of course, is English language teaching materials, course books and grammars and other resources for the teaching of English as an additional language, academic purposes, etc. And I suppose similarly, we're sort of tracking the trajectory of corpus linguistics as it became more applied over time, and language teaching and learning, of course, in applied linguistics, huge area of application of corpus methods. I suppose I'm asking you to talk similarly as to how you just did about lexicography, but how has corpus linguistics changed the industry of English language teaching?
Well, I think the contributions have been several and different in a way. One of the things that corpus linguistics has done, and I think this isn't often enough talked about perhaps, is that it leveled the playing field between native speaker researchers and teachers and expert non-native researchers and teachers. When I started as an English teacher, the native speaker was the oracle in the staff room, to whom all non-native teachers turned for decisions on usage. Our word was absolute truth. The great thing about a corpus is that it doesn't give any particular advantage to a native speaker researcher. Many really great expert non-native speaker corpus linguists hail from Scandinavia, Japan, France, Spain, China, all over the world. So this leveling of the playing field, I think, is really important, that anyone can use and benefit from a corpus, whether you are a so-called native speaker or non-native user of the language. Secondly, and I think this is perhaps again fairly obvious, corpus linguistics has enabled a new level of awareness of how the English language and other languages are actually used, rather than how people think we use language. And that has led to the production of teaching materials that have a more natural feel and which can be more specifically targeted. For example, you might target a corpus, as we did, to young adult learners, or as others have done, to students studying academic English. So it enables that kind of targeting of language, which we didn't have as easily to hand before. And, well, I guess corpora have also had some limited effect through data-driven learning, where learners are directly exposed to corpus data, which in appropriate contexts can be quite motivating. And I found that in my own current EAP teaching, that given the right amount of preparation and motivation, learners really enjoy encountering corpus data in the academic context. But there are things, of course, that corpora haven't done for the industry, and there have been quite a lot of problems along the way, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. One of the things that corpora have not really managed to crack for the English language teaching materials world is some pragmatic information into ELT speaking materials on a wide scale. There are one or two exceptions, but generally speaking, the whole pragmatic area has not made the impact in language teaching materials, which it has made in general corpus research.
Do you think that's because of the issues of scale, in that still a lot of corpus pragmatic research relies upon a great deal of manual annotation, and therefore not being able to get the data sets to a comparable size to the corpora that ELT?
Yes, undoubtedly, it's quite labor intensive to go through corpus data, pragmatically annotating it. But alongside that, anyone who does dive into a corpus, especially if you actually read the corpus like a script in the case of spoken texts, you're very conscious of the way that spoken language weaves this kind of delicate tapestry, almost like a dance between the participants. And so often I felt it would be great if corpus linguistics could give to materials creators some really solid information as to how this happens. Probably will come about at some point in the future. Right now, the situation we're in is that new language courses which are published often claim to be corpus informed, but it's never quite clear how this has been operationalized. And the final products often end up as looking drearily familiar, with speaking activities following well-trodden paths and lacking this level of interactivity and pragmatic content that one finds in natural spoken data.
Do you think
it's not only because of the problems of annotation? I think it's partly the fault of the profession itself, especially publishers, where so many of us are trapped in a four skills mentality, whereby we chop up production and reception into separate components. So you've got speaking and listening and reading and writing, and they're considered to be four types of language phenomena. And if you're stuck in that view, you miss a lot of what a corpus gives you, because what I feel is that spoken corpus data actually offer you the potential for a fifth skill, the strategic and interactional competence that speakers exploit in their own languages, where in spoken interaction, reception and production are woven into this single tapestry which jumps out of corpus data. You can't see them as separate if you're looking at a spoken corpus. So I think it's partly a trap that the profession has fallen into, not necessarily the fault of corpus linguists.
So with the profession, you mentioned about corpus informed materials. Would you say it's almost part of the marketing of the materials that it's valuable to be able to claim, oh yes, this textbook or this course or this syllabus is corpus informed, but you're suggesting that it's not always clear how or to what extent the corpus research has actually informed the materials.
Yes, I mean, the value to publishers for promoting their products as being corpus informed, of course, goes back a long way and goes back to dictionaries. The Cobble Dictionary was the first one to be able to say, look, the whole project was based on masses of data analyzed using computer software, where a great deal of the subjectivity has been taken out of the whole process. So fairly quickly, we reached a situation where all major publishers were publishing dictionaries based on corpora. So it would be utterly bizarre now to imagine major publisher publishing a dictionary and boasting that it's not based on corpus data.
Yeah.
Now, it took a long time for other types of language material to make that kind of claim. But I was looking before this recording session, I had a look at a few publishers' websites, some major ELT publishers, at the courses and products that they advertise. And very often, they do advertise themselves as being corpus informed, and they might have a little logo representing that that there's been some sort of corpus input. But when you actually get into the books and the courses themselves, it's not at all clear in what way the corpus has been used, apart from perhaps obvious things like frequency lists. And so one still has that feeling that there's quite a long way to go, in fact, before we can really look at language teaching materials and say, yes, these definitely within the stack of good corpus research and incorporation of the kind of strategic and pragmatic and interactive information that we get from a spoken corpus. Now, I have to say that I was very privileged to be involved in the Touchstone and Viewpoint projects, working with two colleagues, two superb corpus linguistics and language pedagogical experts, Shan McCarthy and Helen Sandiford, where we really were able to dig deep into the spoken corpora that we had available. It took a very, very long time and a lot of pretty intense manual labor, as we were mentioning earlier, for lack of automation and pragmatic information. But we did explicitly transfer such pragmatic, interactive information into the material, made it explicit. We weren't afraid to say, look, this is information from our database. This is information we can offer you as the most frequent way in which a particular function or particular linguistic strategy is realized. But I think those are few and far between.
I want to peel back the curtain a little bit, I suppose, or invite you to do so. I wanted to ask about the process really for the course books that you authored or co-authored yourself. Because I think for a lot of people, there's probably a lot of mystery around, editorial decisions and how these books come to be in terms of deciding what goes in and what doesn't, and the principles around how the corpus data informs such decisions. So, let's say, and I might be making up a situation that never actually exists. So apologies if that is the case, but you're commissioned to write a textbook, and you've got all of the corpus data that's at your disposal, at your fingertips. How much is kind of dictated to you in terms of, okay, this book needs to cover X, Y, Z areas of grammar, or whatever the skills are that have been covered, or the particular age group, or the particular context that's being targeted, and how much is up to you as the writer and the researcher to kind of go, well, I've looked and the data is telling me that this feature is really common, so I think we need to have an entire section about this thing, which where is it somewhere in the middle, or how much autonomy do you have to essentially allow the data to dictate how the books look based on frequency and other features?
Right. Well, that's a complex question, which has a complex answer, but I'll try and take you through it. The first task is to identify the target audience. There's no point in starting with a corpus if you don't know who the people are that you hope are going to benefit from its incorporation into the materials. So in the case of the Touchstone Viewpoint series, this was partly led by the publisher in terms of their publication plan. Publishers have 5-year plans or 7-year plans or whatever. They know what they want to do. Publishers also run focus groups. But the interesting thing is, which I always remind people, is that when we started on the Touchstone project in 1997, no focus groups were pleading for corpus-based materials. Henry Ford famously said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And in a way, that applies to the focus groups in the ELT industry. Nobody said, what we need is corpus-based materials. Mm-hmm. So another early stage of the process was to spread the word, as it were, through conference talks, workshops, interviews, articles about what corpus linguistics was, what it could do, and how corpus insights might benefit ELT materials. So before we ever published anything, there was all this groundwork to do in trying to get the teaching profession on our side to see that potentially this could be game-changing. And that this was often an uphill struggle. I don't deny it. But little by little, enthusiasm did grow. In the meantime, having identified the target audience, which were young adults in this case, we set out to gather relevant spoken corpus data to create a targeted corpus. In fact, the particular project was aimed at young adults who were learning North American spoken English as opposed to British spoken English. And we recorded speakers in different parts of the USA and Canada chatting on a wide variety of everyday topics. So we had our corpus. We're trying to lay the groundwork with the target teaching audience. And then, of course, we have to begin the actual research. And the process of the research involved pretty basic stuff, quite a lot of spoken written comparisons. Because the spoken data on its own, we often found wasn't enough to reveal its special nature. What you really found out as the most exciting aspect of the spoken data was when you compared it with a similar sized contemporary corpus of written texts. And what sprang out most of all to us at that time, and this was something we had to persuade the publishers, was the extent to which spoken usage came in chunks, was chunked, confirming John Sinclair's famous idiom principle, as he called it, whereby meaning is created in strings of words rather than individual words on their own. So a focus on formulaic language, formulaic sequences became just as important as single words. And that was one thing we had to persuade the publishers, that it was really worth investing in this notion of chunks and the value of chunked language. The other interesting thing about the research was an important principle of the data retrieval and interpretation was, wherever possible, to choose data which learners could relate to their personal lives and which they could personalize in the exercises and activities in the course book. So, we would discard data which was too exotically outside of what would typically be the learner's experience and interest. We edited transcripts. We adapted them. Since it was obvious that raw transcripts, unedited raw transcripts with all their fragmentation and overlaps and false starts, etc., could be as off-putting and demotivating as they might potentially be the opposite. And corpus purists may well have and probably did object to that, but I personally make no excuse for it. The overall aim was to give teachers and learners a familiar experience, yet one where this backstory was based on naturally occurring data. So it was this very careful juggling of priorities. And of course, the publisher wanted something that teachers could pick up next Monday morning and use. That it was no good producing material where the teachers would need a 4-week training course before they could even open the book. So that was another constraint, was it's got to look and feel familiar. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be able to be authenticated by the learners. But at the same time, it had to have that naturalness that one could derive from the spoken corpus data. Sorry, it's quite a complex answer, but then it's quite a complex question. We were lucky. We had a publisher who at that time was very visionary, very open to new ideas. I think since then, publishers have become much more risk averse.
So I want to pick up on something you just said there about editing the examples and providing a familiar experience to teachers and learners. I suppose what you might call a hallmark of the whole point of corpus linguistics for many people is the idea that we're getting a bird's eye view on real language. What do people actually do with language? And there's an awful lot of talk about authentic language data, particularly in teaching and learning materials, the sort of ELT industry and authentic corpus-informed materials seems to be something you hear quite a lot, these sorts of buzzwords. But as you were saying, real life is messy and transcripts of natural conversation are not neat and tidy. And so from a register perspective, that's one thing. But also, of course, what people actually talk about when you are not controlling and the words that they use when you're not telling them that they can't say certain things or censoring them in any way. So, I've done some research on swearing, for instance, and I may be wrong, but I don't believe that there's any mainstream ELT textbook that has a section on here are the swear words and here's how to use them. So I may be wrong, but I suspect probably not. And there are, of course, a lot of other things that in certain markets may be culturally sensitive that publishers may seek to avoid. Of course, the cost of that, I suppose, being authenticity, right? If we're censoring or adapting what people say. So I want to actually bring up something that you wrote in a paper recently in language teaching. You published just a few years ago a sort of reflection of your career, 55 years and counting at the time. I think we're a little bit beyond 55 now, but 55 years and counting, a half century of getting things half right. So I think it was a wonderful title. And one of the things you said was, I sympathize with creatively minded authors who are blocked from portraying anything but a particular version of reality by risk-averse publishers. I speak from experience. My own co-authored materials have been subject to such constraints, and I've had to live with them. Now, I'm not asking you to, tell tales or grass on any particular publisher, but I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I suppose a tension between these two perspectives, really, authenticity and commercial publishers protecting and maximizing their markets.
Yeah, well, of course, I have been in the midst of those debates, and there is no doubt that one has to be sensitive to one's target audience. And I don't personally find it terribly difficult to hold back from particular areas. So taboo language, for example, swearing, you mentioned swearing. I think not only could this be offensive to many users, but it's actually something that's incredibly difficult for anyone to do in a second or foreign language, as I know from my own experience with Swedish and Spanish, that I would almost feel slightly absurd in trying to swear in those languages. So that sort of thing, I think there are very good arguments why one should not mention it. Occasionally, there's a sort of irritation when there's so many sort of worthy values into the debate, like, you can't mention tobacco. You can't even teach someone to say, I'm sorry, I don't smoke, because you're not allowed to mention tobacco. So occasionally you get these sort of overzealous editors who want to go a little bit too far with that kind of thing. But in general, I would say that it's perfectly understandable that religion and politics are no-go areas. These are minefields. So one tries to use discernment and common sense. However, there is one thing that kind of nags slightly at me, and it goes back to the late 90s, the beginning of the time when Ron Carter and I were talking about the Cancode corpus to wider audiences. And in particular, you mentioned the article I published. I think it was in that article. I also mentioned that in one of our talks, an audience member said that they didn't want to hear about Ron Carter's and Mike McCarthy's semi-literate friends when we were talking about the speakers in our corpus. And this does, to me, betray a slightly worrying aspect of the whole thing. And that is that, yes, indeed, we were rather proud that we covered quite a wide range of speakers in the Cancode corpus from a wide social spectrum, including a number of our own friends and relatives who were so very ordinary working class people. And we couldn't escape the fact that middle class expression and values did, at the time, probably still do in the minds of many, form the bedrock of BLT pedagogy and publishing. It's a very middle class world, dominated by middle class values, run by middle class people. And so there is this constraining factor there in terms of social class, as there is in so much of life in Britain, whereby diversity means anything other than including the ordinary, plain, working class population. So there was that sort of nagging worry behind it. And in the case of grammar, there was a belief that spoken grammar was some sort of corrupt version of written grammar instead of the opposite. And that held sway among many teachers, and that was a real hill to climb. And I can't say we got over those problems, but one of the things we tried to do was to show how unnatural spoken interaction could sound if one stripped away the quintessentially spoken grammatical features. But I do think that since that time, people have a more open attitude to the notion of spoken grammar and so on now. I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's partly to do with the problems of juggling the data with the world in which that data is going to be operationalized and applied and incorporated. And it's not easy. It's a very complex matter. And one can only try to sort of chip away at it.
I'm interested in what you said there about the sort of earlier skepticism. You mentioned the Cancode, the Cambridge and Nottingham corpus of discourse in English that you built, as you said, with your late colleague Ron Carter in the 1990s. And there was another sort of criticism from the time that you mentioned in your paper in language teaching, which was essentially about, is it appropriate that a corpus of British English should be used to be teaching English to a global market of learners of English when actually, there are many, many Englishes, and should we be, imposing sort of imperialistically kind of imposing a dominant variety across all of these other sort of populations of learners, and you wrote quite a lot about that, and you you weren't sort of defending that position in terms of saying that's how we did it and that was the right approach, but rather more pragmatically, you were talking about, it was an emerging field and this was sort of where we were with the data at the time. And since then, things have changed. So I suppose, what are your thoughts on this now? Do you think that sort of present day ELT publishing has moved away from kind of this predominantly British English or American English or Australian English view, or is it still kind of the same?
Well, again, that's a complex question, but let me tackle it from this end. Okay, so reasonable criticism, the Can Code was predominantly British. There was a bit of Irish data in there, but yes, predominantly British. But in fact, Ron Carter and I were never, from the very beginning, interested in promoting a British model. What we were trying to get at is what human beings do when they interact. The actual realizations could as well be Indian English, Irish English, Singaporean, lingua franca English, whatever. But the basic human interactional functions were what the corpus was screaming out at us. And it was often quite challenging to break through that barrier. People would say, oh, no, well, that's what the British say. And we would often say, well, it may be what the British say, but what is more important is what we do rather than what we say, what we're doing with language. And we wanted all the flowers to bloom. I mean, you mentioned that at the time, that was the data we had. No way was anyone going to fund us to go around the world collecting data from everywhere where English was used. And we encouraged other people to go out and do that. If you really think that Singaporean English is different from British English, fine, go and get the data and show us. And people did that. So we have the Hong Kong corpus of spoken English. We have a number of other corpora. But often, despite our attempts to focus on the broadly human values of communication rather than British or American or Caribbean or Indian or whatever, we were brought back to teachers very often not wanting what they thought of as bad English or incorrect models. And the publishers inevitably wanted either British English or American English, depending on their most lucrative markets. And indeed, I mean, I have to say that at that time, it would have been difficult to create corpus-based materials that truly reflected in a balanced way world Englishes with sufficient diversity. We could probably never have pleased a wide enough audience and might have easily fallen into a Eurocentric view of English out there in the world. Having said that, I think there probably is a more diverse range of content in ELT courses now. But it remains to be seen just how representative that diversity is. If English truly is a global language, then it's a huge task to grasp that global character of it. And probably we're still going to end up just getting bits of it, and the bits that suit us, or the bits that suit the publishers, or the bits that suit the teaching profession in a particular part of the world. So it remains to be seen whether the consumers of such material can fully identify with it in terms of their personal goals, their local conditions and cultures. So it's a tricky one, and we have to avoid the trap of a different kind of top-down imposition, not just an imperial top-down imposition, but a sort of an ideological top-down imposition that this is what you need, so this is what I'm giving you. I've decided this is what you need. May work in some cases, in others it may be irrelevant to the local situation.
As we start to wrap up here, I could talk with you for hours because I think this is really fascinating, and it goes clearly well beyond just counting words and publishing exercise and activities to help people learn a language, but it's highly political and ideological when you're interacting with these worldwide huge publishing corporations essentially. And so I think it's really interesting to hear your perspective on the tension. It's a word I was trying to think of earlier, I've remembered now, the tension between the principles that we have purely on doing good research, whatever that looks like, and then the commercial sensitivity of the publishers. I think it's fascinating. Clearly there's more work to be done. And on that theme, as we wrap up, I usually end with some quick questions, although the answers are not always quick.
I'll try and be quick.
Yeah. But I did want to sort of mention that maybe about a year and a half ago, I believe at the 2022 TALC conference, the Teaching and Language Corporate Conference, you gave what I think was sort of billed at the time as your final conference plenary of many. I don't have the number to hand, but I imagine many over your career. We've talked an awful lot about spoken grammar, of course, today. But I suppose, you've been such as in that plenary and in the paper that we mentioned in language teaching, you've been doing, I suppose, a lot of retrospective looking back over your career and how things have changed. And so I suppose I want to ask you to look forward in a quick question. And I think I'll just ask you one quick question, actually, which is, what will corpus research look like in 50 years? Doesn't have to be exactly 50 years, if you want to go so far in the future, but what do you think, where do you think things are going? And you can keep it just within the LT or more broadly if you like, but where do you think we're going in the future?
Well, I think I know where I'd like it to go. Well, I hope that corpus linguistics will be able, through progress in technology, to incorporate multimodal and massive amounts of contextual information, so that, for example, any given text, whether it's spoken or written, will be easily linked with its intertextual relatives. Because after all, no conversation occurs in isolation. A conversation always has echoes of previous conversations, which in turn have echoes of other conversations. So if technology could enable a text to bring up its intertextual relatives speedily and automatically, I think that would be great. It might be, again, easier to do with written text. So, if you take a newspaper text, you could link it with a broadcast text or a text online. So creating that great kind of web, in the true sense of the word, of a web of texts, whether spoken or written, that can be easily accessible by idiots like me, that would be great. It may take less than 50 years. I'd love to be around to see it, but I doubt, if it's going to take 50 years, I don't think I will be.
Hopefully less than 50 years. I agree. I think from a spoken corpus perspective, I think multimodality is clearly the next huge barrier to overcome, and I'm certain it will happen. I think it's a matter of when and not if. But yes, we'll see just how long it takes. I want to just say thank you, really, for your time today. I know there's probably a million other things that we could have talked about as well, but it's been really, really fascinating getting the chance to chat with you, and very grateful for your time. I will turn briefly to our viewers / listeners to say thank you also for listening to this episode of CorpusCast. Thanks for joining us on your platform of choice, be that YouTube or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Do let us know in the meantime your thoughts using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on X, formerly Twitter, at Aston Corpus, and you can follow me at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by my esteemed colleague, Sam Cook. Thanks again for listening. And thanks once again to Mike McCarthy, Professor Mike McCarthy. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today. And we'll see you soon on our next episode of CorpusCast. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Robbie. Thank you very much.